1941, New Orleans, Louisiana. Before the first American soldier set foot on a European beach, one question was already shaping the war. How do you invade a continent that has no open ports? Most people never think about the boats that made it possible. We remember the soldiers, the generals, the battles, but not the civilian who solved that problem from a small shipyard on the Gulf Coast. So here's the question. Was Andrew Jackson Higgins just a businessman chasing contracts, or the man who quietly gave the Allies their way onto enemy shores? Born in Columbus, Nebraska, 1886, Higgins grew up far from any ocean. He was strong-willed, impatient, and often in trouble, expelled from school for fighting before joining the Nebraska National Guard. Discipline didn't tame him, it simply gave him structure. After brief stints in timber and trade, he moved south to the Mississippi Delta. There, among the bayous and swamps, he noticed a constant problem. Boats built for deep water couldn't operate in shallow channels. By 1910, Higgins was experimenting with designs of his own. He founded a small company in Mobile, Alabama, then moved it to New Orleans, renaming it Higgins Industries. His solution was a flat-bottomed, shallow-draft workboat with a covered propeller, a craft that could slide over mud, debris and sandbars without grounding. He called it the Eureka Boat. It wasn't built for war. It was built for loggers, oilmen and coastal traders who needed reliability where conventional boats failed. But Higgins had a habit of thinking ahead. During the 1930s, while the Great Depression crippled most manufacturers, he kept refining his boat. He studied how weight distribution, hull angles and propeller guards could make a small craft faster and tougher. Each prototype went through brutal field tests in the Louisiana marshes. Higgins wasn't waiting for government approval. He was waiting for a problem big enough to need his solution. That problem arrived in 1938 when the U.S. Marine Corps began searching for a way to land troops on beaches without ports. Their current landing craft were heavy, slow, and forced soldiers to jump over the sides into deep surf. Higgins invited the Marines to New Orleans and demonstrated the Eureka. In tests on Lake Pontchartrain, it outperformed every Navy design. It could run aground, unload, reverse, and clear the beach in minutes. The Marines loved it. The Navy didn't. Many officers dismissed Higgins as a loud civilian who didn't understand military engineering. But the Marines saw potential and ordered prototypes. Higgins immediately began reworking the design for combat. The first versions, called LCPs for landing craft personnel, had high sides but no ramp. Marines still had to climb overboard under fire. Then, after reading reports of a Japanese craft in China with a front bow door, Higgins made a critical change. Overnight he sketched a new version, the LCPR, the R for ramp. It could carry 36 men and drop them directly onto sand in seconds. By 1939, he had solved the mechanical challenge of amphibious assault, yet official interest remained low. The United States wasn't at war, and Navy bureaucracy favored larger contractors. Higgins kept building civilian orders and waited. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Within days, America was at war, and the military needed landing craft immediately. The Navy's shipyards weren't ready. Higgins's were. He offered the government his full production capacity. The result was a contract to build hundreds, then thousands of landing craft. Not only the LCPR, but an improved version capable of carrying vehicles, the LCVP, landing craft, vehicle and personnel. This new model was 36 feet long, powered by a diesel engine, and light enough to be hoisted onto transport ships. It carried a platoon of infantry or a jeep, beached in less than 3 feet of water, dropped its ramp, and backed away under its own power. Simplicity was the secret. It could be built fast, repaired easily, and operated by minimal crew. To meet demand, Higgins expanded from a single factory to a network of shipyards across New Orleans. He bought property along the industrial canal, installed assembly lines, and recruited thousands of workers. Men and women, white and black, skilled and unskilled. Everyone was welcome if they could work. In the segregated South, that was unheard of. Higgins didn't care about politics, he cared about speed. By spring 1942, his plants were running around the clock. Each section of boat construction, hulls, ramps, engines, wiring, had its own line, synchronized for maximum efficiency. When one boat slid into the river for testing, another was already taking its place on the line. Higgins kept a stopwatch in his pocket and personally timed production stages. He demanded that no process be slower than absolutely necessary. Critics in Washington still doubted him. They said wooden boats wouldn't survive heavy seas or gunfire. Higgins replied with performance data. In combat simulations, his craft outmaneuvered steel Navy models every time. By the end of 1942, the proof was visible in every ocean. Higgins boats carried Marines ashore in Guadalcanal, North Africa, and Sicily. Commanders who had once ignored him were now sending telegrams asking for more. His small factory had become one of the most important suppliers in the Allied arsenal. As production expanded, so did his reputation. The press called him the Noah of the modern age. His workers called him the boss who never sleeps. He was known for walking the line with a cigar and a clipboard, shouting numbers over the sound of saws. For him, deadlines weren't suggestions, they were promises to soldiers. By late 1942, more than 8,000 Higgins craft were already in service. Yet Higgins wasn't satisfied. He was improving designs weekly, tightening build times, and training new crews faster than any other manufacturer. He wasn't just producing boats, he was building a wartime system, modular, flexible, and brutally efficient. As America prepared for global offensives, Higgins's boats became the backbone of amphibious warfare. And while generals planned strategies and presidents made speeches, one question remained hanging in the air. The same one we started with. Could the Allies have invaded Europe or the Pacific at all, if a stubborn boat builder from Nebraska hadn't refused to take no for an answer? 1943. The United States was now fighting across two oceans, from the beaches of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific. Every landing, every operation that began with men and machines storming ashore had one thing in common: a flat-bottomed wooden boat built in Louisiana. But while the world watched the battlefronts, the real war machine was running behind factory doors. Inside Higgins Industries, production had reached a level few thought possible. Thousands of carpenters, welders, engineers, and laborers, most of them civilians, were building the Navy's most critical asset. Higgins's headquarters on the Industrial Canal looked less like a shipyard and more like a city. The main plant stretched across multiple blocks. A whistle blew every 4 hours, signaling shift changes for workers who moved in waves through the gates. At peak capacity, the factory operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. By early 1943, Higgins employed over 30,000 people across 7 facilities in New Orleans. Each plant specialized in a different part of the production chain: hull assembly, ramp fabrication, engine mounting, electrical systems, and sea testing. A single boat moved from raw lumber to completion in less than 2 days. For the U.S. Navy, accustomed to months-long shipbuilding cycles, this was industrial shock therapy. Higgins wasn't just building boats. He was rewriting how America built for war. He introduced modular construction, dividing the process into sections that could operate independently. He standardized every bolt and hinge so that parts from one plant could fit any other. If a ramp broke in combat, it could be replaced instantly with one from another batch. That standardization would later become a cornerstone of modern military logistics. But what truly set Higgins apart wasn't the technology, it was the people. His shipyards were among the most racially and socially integrated in the United States. At a time when segregation was law in Louisiana, Higgins ignored it completely. Women worked alongside men. Black and white workers shared benches and break rooms. To him, output mattered more than background. His hiring policy was simple. If you can make the boat float, you're in. That policy wasn't just moral, it was practical. It filled positions fast and kept morale high. Workers saw themselves as part of something larger, not just building boats, but building the means for victory. Photos from the time show thousands of employees crowding around newly finished LCVPs, cheering as each one was launched into the canal. Some wrote their initials inside hulls before they were shipped overseas, a quiet signature of pride that often ended up landing on enemy shores. In Washington, D.C., Higgins had become a known name, and a feared one. He didn't like bureaucracy, and bureaucracy didn't like him. He openly criticized the Navy's slow decision-making and once described its paperwork as a disease. When procurement officers hesitated to approve contracts, Higgins simply built the boats anyway, confident they'd be needed. He was almost always right. By mid-1943, Higgins Industries had delivered 12,000 landing craft, plus hundreds of patrol boats and supply barges. The company was producing an average of 700 vessels per month, a figure no other contractor could match. To sustain that pace, Higgins turned his factories into full ecosystems. On-site cafeterias, clinics, training schools, and housing projects for workers' families. Efficiency was enforced with military discipline. Supervisors carried clipboards marked with production quotas. Higgins himself roamed the plants daily, stopwatch in hand. If he spotted a bottleneck, he stopped the line and restructured the workflow on the spot. He wasn't afraid to fire managers, even senior ones, if they couldn't keep up. "We can lose a day," he told one foreman, "but we can't lose a war." Every week, boats were floated down the Mississippi River for testing. Inspectors recorded performance data, checked ramp functions, and logged each vessel by serial number. Once approved, the boats were loaded onto freight trains heading to coastal bases. From there, they would be shipped to England, Africa, and the Pacific. While other manufacturers struggled with material shortages, Higgins improvised. When steel was rationed, he used laminated mahogany. When engines ran short, he repurposed truck motors. Nothing stopped production. That adaptability, the same quality that defined his early years in the bayou, was now powering one of the largest private military operations in America. In the Pacific, reports from the field confirmed that Higgins boats were changing warfare. Marines wrote back, describing how the LCVPs handled coral reefs and surf better than any other craft. Commanders called them lifelines. In North Africa, the same design carried U.S. troops ashore during Operation Torch, helping secure Allied footholds. By the end of 1943, military planners in Britain were finalizing the strategy for the next phase, the cross-channel invasion of Nazi-occupied France. That operation, soon to be known as D-Day, would require over 5,000 landing craft. The U.S. Navy made it clear most of them would come from one man, Andrew Jackson Higgins. Eisenhower's logistics officers visited New Orleans to inspect production. What they saw shocked them. Boats rolled off assembly lines faster than trucks left Detroit. Every step of the process was tracked by Higgins's personal control board, showing quotas, deliveries, and backlogs. The numbers moved like a heartbeat, constant, precise, unrelenting. Behind those numbers were thousands of ordinary Americans. Carpenters, electricians, mechanics, building something that would carry soldiers halfway across the world. Many of them had never left Louisiana. They didn't know where their boats were going, only that they were needed. As 1944 approached, Higgins was at the height of his influence. He had contracts worth hundreds of millions, personal access to Navy leadership, and the respect of generals who once ignored him. Yet even then, he refused to slow down. He told a reporter, We're not done until we can land anywhere, anytime, under any conditions. That philosophy soon faced its ultimate test. The invasion of Europe was coming, and when it did, every inch of coastline would depend on the reliability of Higgins's design. For the soldiers preparing in England, the ramp of the LCVP was a doorway to the unknown. For Higgins, it was the proof of everything he had built his life around, that simplicity, speed, and defiance could win a war. June 6, 1944, Normandy, France. The sea was rough, the sky grey. Allied soldiers waited in silence, packed shoulder to shoulder in small wooden boats painted grey and green. Ahead lay German machine guns, concrete bunkers, and mined beaches. Behind them, the largest naval fleet in history. Between the two, a 36-foot craft built in New Orleans by a civilian named Andrew Jackson Higgins. It's easy to picture D-Day as a grand strategy, a sweeping moment of liberation, but in truth, it came down to design, to whether a single type of boat could deliver men, jeeps, and supplies onto a hostile beach fast enough to survive the first 10 minutes of combat. That boat was the LCVP, the landing craft, vehicle, and personnel. It was small, flat-bottomed, and powered by a single diesel engine. It looked simple, but its shallow draft and front ramp system made it revolutionary. Before Higgins, invasions required harbors. After Higgins, they could happen anywhere. At 6:30 a.m., the first wave of landings hit Omaha Beach. The ramps slammed down and water rushed in as soldiers charged forward. Many never made it past the sand, but the boats kept coming, wave after wave, hour after hour. More than 20,000 Higgins boats carried troops that day. Without them, the landings simply couldn't have happened. General Dwight Eisenhower later said, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us. If Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, we never could have landed over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different." That wasn't praise. It was a statement of fact. Every Allied landing from the Pacific to the Mediterranean depended on Higgins's design. The boat's ramp allowed tanks and jeeps to roll directly onto sand, eliminating the slow, deadly process of unloading from deep-draft ships. Its wooden hull absorbed shock better than steel and could be repaired quickly in the field. In Normandy, the boats performed beyond expectations. Many were destroyed under fire, but the majority completed multiple runs between transports and beaches. Pilots and engineers reported that the flat-bottom design allowed them to beach even through rough surf and debris. When the tide rose, they simply reversed off and went back for more. Meanwhile, halfway around the world, the same design was defining the war in the Pacific. On islands like Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, Marines used Higgins boats to cross reefs that had stopped earlier invasions cold. Commanders who had lost hundreds of men in earlier operations now relied entirely on LCVPs. The craft turned amphibious assault from a desperate gamble into a calculated operation. Back home in New Orleans, Higgins's factories worked at full capacity. D-Day had pushed demand to new heights. Every factory line ran 24 hours a day. Women built hulls, teenagers installed wiring, and veterans fresh from basic training came to work between deployments. The scale was unmatched, thousands of boats each month. The government tried to replicate Higgins's success by licensing his design to other shipyards. Dozens of plants across the US and Britain began producing LCVPs under contract, but most still depended on Higgins for parts, blueprints, and engineering oversight. Even his competitors had to follow his methods. The success of the LCVP created new demands. The Navy wanted larger landing ships for tanks and artillery, so Higgins developed the LCM, capable of carrying 30 tons of cargo or a medium tank. It used the same core principles, a shallow draft, reinforced bow ramp, and fast build time. Within months, it too was being deployed in Europe and the Pacific. By late 1944, more than 23,000 Higgins craft had been built. Combined, they made up nearly 12% of the entire US Navy fleet. No other private company in the world had produced so much naval equipment in such a short time. But the success brought pressure. Labor strikes, material shortages, and wartime inflation hit the shipyards hard. Higgins fought to keep production stable, often arguing directly with Washington officials. He accused them of managing victory with red tape, a phrase that appeared in newspapers and made him both famous and unpopular. Still, the Navy couldn't ignore him. When they needed more boats, they went back to New Orleans. Even foreign leaders took note. Winston Churchill called the Higgins craft one of the key reasons Allied strategy worked. Military analysts credited its versatility for making operations like Overlord, Torch, and Dragoon possible. Wherever a coastline became a battlefield, Higgins's boats were there first. The D-Day victory transformed Higgins's reputation. He was no longer just an industrialist. He was now part of the war's story. Newspapers dubbed him the man from New Orleans who built victory. His photo appeared in Life magazine, showing him in his office surrounded by scale models and blueprints, yet he refused to celebrate. When asked what it felt like to have helped win the war, he simply said, "We still have landings to make." Even after Normandy, his boats continued to shape the war's end. They carried troops up the rivers of Germany during the final advance. They ferried supplies across the Pacific for the planned invasion of Japan. When the atomic bombs fell and the war ended, thousands of LCVPs sat in harbors from France to the Philippines, weathered, bullet-scarred, but still functional. In total, more than 1.5 million Allied soldiers had landed on enemy shores aboard Higgins's designs. His boats had changed not just how wars were fought, but how they could be won. They turned geography, once the enemy of invasion, into an advantage. As peace returned, Higgins's factories began to slow. Orders were cancelled and contracts expired. By 1945, the noise of saws and engines began to fade. But even as his empire wound down, Higgins understood that his contribution was already written in history. He had proved something few believed possible, that a civilian's idea, born in the swamps of Louisiana, could decide the fate of nations. Still, one question lingered, the kind every inventor faces when the world moves on. When the war ends, what happens to the man who built it? 1945. The war was over. The landings had succeeded. Across Europe and the Pacific, Higgins boats, burned, bullet-riddled and battered by saltwater, sat abandoned on beaches they had once conquered. The sound of the engines was gone, but the man who built them was not finished. Andrew Jackson Higgins stood in the middle of his quiet factory yards and faced a new kind of battle, one without orders, medals, or glory. For 4 years, his company had operated at full speed. Now, overnight, everything stopped. With peace came cancellation. The Navy terminated most of its contracts. The military no longer needed 30,000 workers producing landing craft. Higgins had built the tools for invasion, but there was no invasion left to fight. He tried to pivot quickly. He proposed converting his factories to manufacture yachts, fishing vessels and cargo ships, even prefabricated housing for returning soldiers. But the post-war economy was chaotic. The government that once begged him for boats now ignored his proposals. His company, Higgins Industries, was running out of money. The same plants that symbolized wartime efficiency became a financial burden. Unused materials piled up, and entire workshops stood idle. By 1946, he began shutting down divisions, laying off thousands of workers who had once cheered every launch. Higgins refused to accept decline. He founded a smaller firm, Higgins Inc., to focus on research and experimental craft. He poured his energy into new projects, high-speed patrol boats, hydrofoils, and even early hovercraft concepts. He experimented with lightweight metals and new propulsion systems. He believed amphibious innovation had only just begun. But without the urgency of war, funding disappeared. Private investors saw little profit in peacetime military designs. At the same time, labor unrest grew. Wartime unity fractured into strikes and contract disputes. Higgins, famous for his inclusive workforce, now faced pressure from unions demanding higher pay and shorter hours. Negotiations stalled production further. It was a sharp reversal for a man who once symbolized American industrial unity. The strain began to show. Higgins's health declined from years of exhaustion. The endless battles, with Washington, with suppliers, with labor, drained him. The Navy awarded new contracts to larger corporations like General Motors and Bethlehem Steel, leaving him out. His influence in Washington faded as quickly as it had risen. Yet in the eyes of history, his impact was becoming clearer. Reports from military strategists credited Higgins's designs as a decisive factor in Allied victory. Without the LCVP, amphibious warfare as practiced in World War II would have been impossible. The simple ramped boat had rewritten invasion tactics. Even post-war navies adopted its principles for riverine and coastal operations. Eisenhower's words continued to echo. If Higgins had not designed and built those landing craft, we never could have landed over an open beach. In 1947, Higgins received several civilian awards for wartime service, including honors from the Navy and Marine Corps. But his financial empire was collapsing. Most of his plants along the industrial canal were dismantled or sold. The once roaring shipyards became silent warehouses. Still, he refused to fade quietly. He funded scholarships for engineering students, lectured on manufacturing methods, and advised small boat builders across the Gulf Coast. Even in decline, his drive remained. Those who worked with him said he never stopped sketching ideas, new hull shapes, propulsion systems, and amphibious vehicles. On August 1, 1952, Andrew Jackson Higgins died in New Orleans at the age of 65. The man who had once employed tens of thousands was laid to rest with a small private ceremony. No state funeral, no military parade, just family, former workers, and a few Marines who came to pay their respects. For years, his name faded from public memory. The world moved on to jet engines, nuclear submarines, and new wars. But the legacy of his invention never disappeared. Every modern landing craft, from Vietnam's river patrol boats to today's amphibious assault vehicles, carries the same DNA: shallow draft, flat bottom, and front ramp. The formula he perfected in the 1940s still defines naval mobility. In time, historians rediscovered him. The National Outlived Museum in New Orleans now dedicates an entire wing to his work. Visitors can walk inside a full-scale Higgins boat, touch the ramp, and imagine the moment when it dropped on Omaha Beach. On the wall above it, a single quote is printed in bold: "The man who won the war for us." For those who understand what it means, it's not exaggeration. It's a reminder that wars are not won only by generals or soldiers, but also by the engineers, builders, and problem solvers who make the impossible work. Higgins's life remains a paradox. He built the boats that enabled victory, but he lost everything once victory was achieved. He broke barriers in hiring decades before civil rights laws, yet was nearly forgotten by the society he helped defend. He proved that one determined civilian could reshape military history, but died without the fortune or fame others gained from his work. Still, the evidence of his legacy is everywhere. Every photograph of a soldier rushing down a wooden ramp, every veteran who remembers that jarring splash into surf, all of it traces back to Higgins's factory floors in New Orleans. The man who once said, "The hell I can't," turned a local workboat into a global instrument of liberation. He didn't just build boats, he built access to the very idea that no fortress, no coastline, and no empire was beyond reach. 80 years later, the boats rot quietly in museums and harbors, but their story still moves. They remind us that behind every massive operation, there's often one stubborn inventor who refused to accept the word impossible. Andrew Jackson Higgins was that man, the builder who made the landings possible, the innovator who changed warfare forever, and the forgotten engineer who proved that sometimes history's greatest victories begin not in battle, but in a workshop.